The last Battlestar Galactica and a ragtag fugitive fleet receive a mysterious message that might point them to Earth or a Cylon trap. Battle of the Network shows. Join Rick Brooks and Mike Kogel as they explore the TV of the 70s and 80s through hand-picked episodes of their favorite and not-so-favorite series.
Welcome to the Season 9 Battle of the Network Show's season finale. I'm Mike.
And I'm Rick. Hello, everyone.
And we're going to go out with our second episode in a row about an apocalypse.
Yeah, here we go. What a cheerful way to end a great season, huh?
Yes. And I believe we talked about Mormons earlier this season. That might come up.
Now, this is an interesting coincidence, I assure you, but yes.
So anyway, we're going to be talking about Battlestar Galactica, the original series, not the remake, obviously, and not the 1980 thing.
Yet. Not yet.
Not yet. Science fiction series from the mind of Glenn Larson. Some might say also a science fiction series from the mind of George Lucas.
Oh.
No.
Oh.
Well, why don't we get into that right now?
Some might say, and some have said it.
Yes.
I think some have said it in depositions and courtrooms.
So, this show came out in 1978 on the heels of Star Wars. I only recently learned, this shouldn't be a surprise, that they had started developing it in the summer when Star Wars was becoming a hit. Obviously, that part's not a coincidence. And Glenn Larson hired a number of people who had worked on Star Wars. John Dykstra was leading the special effects, and he was heavily involved in the special effects on the first Star Wars, but didn't get along with George Lucas and wasn't going to be coming back for any more. But he had started a company that, in between the movies, was renting the equipment that belonged to Lucas and ended up using it for this. And that, in part, led to one of the many lawsuits.
Hey, guys got to make a living, you know?
Yeah, and technically that means George Lucas was making money from this. But also Ralph McQuarrie, who designed a lot of the Star Wars characters and ships and locations, did some initial design work on this, and there's going to be a similarity when you get a lot of the same people involved, I think. Now, Glenn Larson, I know, always claimed that he had this idea since the 60s. And a book I read suggested that maybe that he was covering himself by saying that. But there are similarities, but I don't think it's that. It's surface stuff. I mean, there's a look, and the effects are done in a similar way, and it is a sort of space opera. Although I find, and you might agree with this or not, that to me it feels like somewhere in between a space opera and a Star Trek kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's not quite full-blown fantasy in space.
I can see that, and I think when you watch the pilot, the beginning of, and just you see the beginning of it and you're like, okay, man. And it's a lot more obvious at the beginning, maybe some of the Star Wars influence. However, I also think as you go through the entire series, as both of us have done, it's easy to forget about that. It becomes less derivative of Star Wars and more kind of its own thing. It's just part of the natural progression of the show. So when I first got back into this, I was like, oh yeah, and Lori and I were watching it together and kind of laughing, just like the similarity of the musical score, the font, and the credits, things like that. But once you get going, it becomes less a Star Wars clone and more of its own thing, I think.
Yeah. I mean, Starbuck is, a little bit of a Han Solo kind of type, but that was already a type. Like they took the Han Solo type from Westerns. So it's not like George Lucas invented that. And I think something that's similar but different, they're both influenced by various mythologies and religions and things, but I think Larson's influences are pretty much all Western, whereas Lucas took a lot from more Eastern religion. And of course, Glenn Larson at least grew up being a Mormon. I'm not sure if he still was when he was making that, but that is an influence on the show. I don't entirely know. I don't know enough about the ins and outs of that religion to put all those pieces together. I mean, I know like the idea of there being 13 tribes of Israel comes from Judaism, but then, or 12 the tribes anyway, and then the idea of there being a lost tribe is at least tied into the Mormon mythology. And I don't know, from there, I get confused once I start reading that stuff. So
It might be one of those things that for those who really know that they can see it, it's more obvious, and for those who don't, it kind of goes over their heads, or it's enough that it's not really a distraction when you're watching it. I do think in particular, the Star Wars comparison, I don't want to say overblown, but I think it's just a natural result of when it came out and the timing of everything. But for me, I'll just say it right now, I love this show. I really, really enjoyed it, and I really liked revisiting it. And as far as it being like a quote unquote copy of anything, whether it be legally actionable or not, which we can get into, when I was a kid and it was on, I was too young to care if it was derivative of anything else. It's like, okay, this is stuff I like, okay. And now that I'm older, it seems like I've come full circle. It's like, you know what? Maybe it's derivative of other stuff, but again, who cares? It's not like the Star Wars franchise has moved on to other things, and it's creating great things right now as we do this podcast. But the movies are in the past, and to me, it's like going through and watching this is like, okay, it's almost like rediscovering more of something that, yeah, it's a little bit like Star Wars, but I love Star Wars, and in a similar way, I really love this show, and I enjoyed revisiting the whole series. I'd watched episodes before, and in the not too distant past, actually, but because I knew we were going to do the podcast, I got the Blu-rays and watched the whole set, and I really enjoyed it. And I really don't care at this point. It's almost like if it were coming out and if I were watching this in 1978, maybe I'd think differently. But now it's like enough time's passed that it's just like, to me, it's just cool stuff. And I accept the fact that there's similarities to other things, that it's taking things from other mythologies and all that. It just really doesn't bother me at all. Now, I might mock it every now and then, but I still enjoy the show overall.
Right. And, in 1978, when I was 5, again, we've talked about this before, other than the holiday special, and PSAs, Star Wars wasn't on TV or anything. So we got the toys, but we were waiting for more.
Yeah. I mean, what's wrong with having something like this on television?
Yeah. And I definitely remember being like all in on this show and talking about it in the daycare center playground and
around the daycare center water cooler.
Yep. And, I had a bunch of the toys, and not great toys, but I mean, so there were action figures the size of Star Wars figures, but not quite as good. They didn't have any ships or anything. The ships were smaller and came with tiny figures, and of course the infamous firing rockets. Unfortunately some kids died swallowing those, and then the ones after that, the rockets didn't fire, and that affected the Boba Fett figure and all that. But it was disappointing that there wasn't a ship that fit the figures.
Right.
On the other hand, the Cylon figure was pretty cool, other than his legs didn't move. But and then I had like a giant Cylon that I watched something recently on YouTube about those, and apparently those were actually like just repurposed Mattel figures from some other line, and not very well made. But boy, did I think it was cool at the time.
Yeah.
And I even had pajamas with
wow.
They had a logo and some picture on it, and a cape.
Hey, cool.
And they were really scratchy.
Oh.
But I liked them anyway.
I seem to remember having a few of the original Marvel comics. Boy, I sure wish I still had those now.
I'd like to see those because a lot of my favorite artists worked on them. So I bet they're pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't think they've been collected that I know of.
And there might be some Titan Comics or somebody. I think there's some collection out there,
like an overseas kind of thing.
Yeah, or it's some giant $45 book or something that's out of print. Yeah, you do see them in the dollar bins and things.
Yeah, and I'll be looking for those. But kind of going again to the Star Wars thing, you know what I have in my hand, Mike? The 1978 TV Guide Fall Preview. And there's a full page for each new show. And I'm looking at the Battlestar Galactica entry. And may I favor you with a passage or two from their description of it?
Please.
I think it's revealing of what the perception was maybe in the industry. TV Guide was about as mainstream as it could get, as far as like reflecting the mainstream, I would say. So they got a really cool picture here of Lorne Greene flanked by Dirk Benedict and Richard Hatch. And they all have very serious looks on their face, by the way. There's nothing about this picture that would make you think, oh, this is a camp fest or anything like that. It looks very serious, especially Starbuck. He's got like kind of a real nasty glare in his eye. And they have their guns, their laser pistols kind of drawn facing the camera, their blasters or whatever. So it gives a brief description here. It says, Galactica, a majestic battle star, soars through space accompanied by a caravan of smaller vehicles. They carry the survivors of an advanced human civilization who are fleeing from a galaxy far, far away from Nate and Al's delicatessen, where the premise for this series was probably dreamed up. I mean, so right there, you're seeing that they kind of have a snide attitude towards it,
Yeah.
and they get the far, far away reference in there, right?
Hmm.
Then they say everybody else has been wiped out by the Cylons, a thoroughly nasty race of mechanical beings who are bent on achieving, quote, the final annihilation of the life form known as man, end quote. And there's a couple of other sentences using a lot of quotation marks, I think in a vaguely mocking way. They're using the terminology of the show, and then they say, between them and their destination lurk a lot of sneaky Cylons as well as other hostile beings, plus sundry surprises concocted by John Dykstra, who created the special effects for Star Wars, and is producing this sci-facsimile of the movie. So there you go. And then it just says the large cast is headed by Lauren Green as the commander of the fleet and Richard Hatch and Dirk Benedict as a pair of Daredevil space aces.
Man.
So that's kind of telling. They're really kind of, if you look at that description, they're calling it a Star Wars ripoff, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the Nate Now's thing, that just seems dismissive of the creative process. Plenty of great stuff comes from people writing or discussing things in eateries.
Yes, and including a lot of our ideas for this podcast were conceived at some of the finer eateries and even some, delis.
Yeah. So take that, TV Guide.
Yeah, I'm a little offended. And that line almost seemed dismissive of science fiction in general.
Yeah. Well, a TV Guide had some. I've seen some reviews posted recently of shows, including the Rockford Files, that were pretty snide. So they might have been mainstream, but they had an attitude back then.
They did, yeah. And just looking at the original reviews and things, and one thing that they seem to frown on is they seem to frown on things that seem derivative, right away. And especially, and the thing is, they're talking about shows that who knows how much of this they'd even seen, but they don't get a chance to see the shows grow, and maybe sometimes those shows don't get a chance to grow. But
right, which of course is a problem now with the way TV critics and recappers and stuff work. That everything is treated week to week.
Yeah.
Without the sense of what's the bigger picture here.
Yeah, and I mean, who's to say actually how many shows back then were canceled too soon, or maybe would have become something else and grown past maybe some of the limitations of the premise. And maybe Battlestar Galactica is one of those shows.
Yeah, lawsuits and derivativeness aside, this production seems like it was pretty hampered almost from the beginning, in the sense that it was originally going to be a series of movies, and then ABC decided sort of last minute to make it a series, and so the quality is very uneven because they were rushed into writing scripts and rushed into making episodes.
And go right there. I mean, this is an epic science fiction story with a huge amount of special effects. It's not like, Sunday Night Playhouse where you can just put on a stage play each week and cut corners without people noticing. I mean, that seems to me a very rash decision to suddenly say, hey, we want this as a regular series on the fall schedule. You might be able to get away with that with other programs, and they have in the past, but this one maybe really suffered from it. I mean, and I'm kind of fascinated by the production history of it because in many ways it seems like two different shows to me.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell the episodes that were intended sort of as these movies, like the first, I guess it breaks down as the first 5, and then there's another 2-parter that feels that way. But then you get these single episodes that are derivative in maybe a not good way. They're sort of westerns basically, and many of them involve one of the heroes crash landing on a planet. The fleet, there's no way we can save them. Well, okay, we'll save them.
Yeah. Or, and also some of those episodes expose the premise that there's nobody else like them, that they're struggling to find people. And they kind of abandon that eventually, but it takes away the uniqueness of them because they go to these planets where it looks like big deal. Everybody's humans anyway.
Right, yeah.
Oh, this is some other people like fled here, And I think one of the problems is just that some of those early episodes you mentioned, they came too close to each other, which is funny because by the end of the season, the one season had, there's like a show that's sort of like a courtroom show, an episode, and I really enjoyed that. And I was kind of liking these ways of telling different kinds of stories rather than the endless cycle of fleeing and pairing with the Cylons. I kind of like the idea to tell different kind of stories, even though some of those would have seemed like filler under different circumstances. I thought the show had found its stride a little bit more, and I was enjoying the direction of the show by the end of the season.
Well, and I think those are more interesting because they get into what life in the fleet is like.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm really fascinated by that. I totally agree with you.
For the listeners who don't know the show, the premise, there are these 12 colonies of humans out there somewhere in space. They live on planets named after the Zodiac, coincidentally. And they've been in this long war with these robotic beings called the Cylons that apparently once were some sort of lizards and became these overrun by these machines or something. And when the series opens, a human has negotiated some sort of treaty with them, but it's all a lie. And they sort of, while the treaty is about to happen, the Cylons attack the colonies in a kind of Pearl Harbor situation. And what's left becomes this quote-unquote ragtag fleet led by the Battlestar Galactica, which is the last of their big military ships. And they're trying to find the 13th colony, which was apparently Earth. And they're being pursued by the Cylons and this human who betrayed them. So we see at times they have to deal with things like, well, where are we going to get food? Where are we going to, how do we deal with courtroom situations? Sort of the evolution of it. At some point they have like athletic events and TV broadcasts and things.
Yeah, and at the beginning of the series, it seems to me like it's more this whole life of the fleet, which is, 200 some ships, I think we're told. It's more of an abstract thing. Like you hear about it, and maybe there's a couple of other ships they go to, but it doesn't really seem like a thing so much as in the second half of the season, more or less. It just seems like a lot of things change, and I don't know how much of it was conscious change or just like the natural evolution of the show finding its way. But by the end of the season, it does become more real, and they are starting to explore more of what this life, what this fleet would be like beyond just like the main characters and, the Battlestar. There's even things in the Battlestar they start exploring.
Yeah, and I think there was a conscious decision to move away from the Cylons a little bit, but I'm not sure why. I haven't found the reasoning behind that. I suspect some of it was budget because the suits were awkward and broke a lot, and the stuntmen in them fell down and things, and it caused delays, and probably a way to avoid some of that production hassle was to get them out of the way for a little while. It's a certain way it's disappointing because they're so cool, but on the other hand, you make a good point. It opens it up to other ideas.
This is where I said before we went on air that I might surprise you, because I actually enjoyed the move away from the Cylons, although they are cool, and I was glad to see them in the episode that we're going to talk about, to kind of give them another go before, we close out the series of Battlestar Galactica. But to me, it was frustrating because they never really established, to my satisfaction, what the whole deal was going on within the Cylon structure. We'd get these glimpses, and it would essentially be a way to show off the cool looking robots, and the traitor Baltar, the main villain of the series, I guess, and the Cylons. A lot of that was inconsistent or not adequately explained, and I think the fact that they didn't really bother to elaborate on that and establish it and make it consistent, to me, I was happy to see them go in other directions for a while.
Yeah, it does surprise me a little bit, but those are good points. Like, what's their beef with humans? Other than it just seems a general, like, we don't like that species sort of thing.
And just how do they work, and what is Baltar's role, and who does he answer to? And it just seems to change based on the needs of the episode. And to be fair, lots of things do, and many TV shows, and in Battlestar Galactica. It's entertaining watching them, but yeah, I was thankful. However, if we had gotten like another full season of Battlestar Galactica, I would have been fine if half the episodes had Cylons, as long as they cleaned up the Cylon mythology a little bit and found new ways to feature them. I would have been fine with that too. So don't get me wrong, I like the Cylons, but I also like the other direction that the show is going in the second half of the season.
Yeah. So the mid-2000s remake, although the Cylons were a huge part of it, they had a different angle on them, but they also did get into a lot of the sort of internal workings of the fleet, the politics of it, and the survival aspects of it. And it quite often was interesting. Sometimes they got bogged down in that stuff too.
Yeah, and that's another thing that they start getting into, like you say, the politics of the fleet.
Yeah,
and which is a little frustrating because the civilian leadership is so ineffectual
right
throughout the original series. In many ways, I think that the show, whether intentionally or not, is a great argument for military authoritarianism and the supremacy of the military, because the military is quite often the most sensible force of anybody in the show.
Yes, yeah. So this book I read called By Your Command, Volume 1 by Alan Stevens and Fiona Moore. So I read part of it. I didn't read the Galactica 80 part. But they sort of posit this theory that, whether intentionally or not, that the show reflected at the time, sort of a new burgeoning idea of neoconservatism. Now, their main argument for that is that when they go to other planets, they show up, they help out, and then they leave pretty quickly, which I guess is sort of fits the neocon idea of going in, taking care of the problem, and then showing people how freedom works and getting at it, and assuming that freedom is so great that they'll follow suit. I don't entirely buy that as a theory about the show. I'll leave out whether I buy it as a theory about real life, but I mean, they're leaving the planets because they have to.
Mm-hmm.
They've got a destination in mind. It's not. But what you say about the military, yeah, that they present politicians as kind of stupid and venal, and the military is sensible.
Now, there is an episode with Paul Fix as a elderly commander who is a disciplinarian and seems to spark at least one mutiny. I don't want to give away too much, but it's kind of remarkable how that comes together. And he is kind of portrayed as someone well-meaning, but behind the times. I think there's a view of like a, dare I say, compassionate conservatism, or just a benign military, benign leadership that just naturally knows based on certain ideals. I have that book, Mike, but I haven't read it yet. But I intend to, now that I've read the whole series, and after we talk, I'm very curious about like not only the production details but about that. And I won't dismiss it out of hand. I'm not saying that you are, but some of the speeches that Apollo makes as the season goes on, Apollo seems to develop more and more of a kind of moral arbiter role in the series, and with a little bit more passion than Adama has. And I wonder if there's something going on there too. Again, it might not be conscious. I mean, we're talking TV was a lot simpler back then, and yes, it was a lot easier to get messages that seem political now would just be seen as like, well, this is just people saying things, like this is just a character, and there was a more good versus evil, and maybe less shades of gray on network television. So it probably wouldn't have been a big deal back then. I'm sure there's some degree of retroactive thinking put in that theory, but I'm curious about it, and there could be something to that.
And there's an episode where they go to a planet Terra that they think is Earth and turns out not to be, but is similar in ways and has a sort of Cold War situation going on, and there are nuclear peace talks, but the way it's presented is essentially that peace talks are a ridiculous idea. And I think Apollo says something like, the only way to stop something like this is with might. And
right, it's deterrence is force.
Right, and the Galactica actually destroys all the missiles that are going off from space.
Yeah.
So maybe they should have called the Star Wars program the Battlestar program instead.
You know what? That's excellent, because Star Wars, we actually saw this happen on Battlestar Galactica, yes, right? And it worked.
Yeah.
Reagan was onto something. I mean, you can't argue the fact that this worked very well on Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, if you have a city-sized spaceship full
yes,
full of skilled humans up there, they can shoot down all the missiles in one go.
Labeling it Star Wars might have been a deliberate attempt to obfuscate and mock the concept, but we saw it executed very well on Battlestar.
Yes.
There is a lot going on here. Now, of course, ultimately, it's a science fiction show with costumes and some general silliness all over the place, so I don't want to get too much into the woods on that, but I think you can. I think you can see a lot of this stuff pretty easily if you watch it. But I think ultimately, I think they are trying to inject like morality and good versus evil and certain ideals about things. And I know from, I think the cast members, I think, believe in that too. Some in particular, I think the original series was very special to them, and I think they believe that they were doing certain things, that there was just a certain basic ideology to the show.
Yeah, and I mean, but a lot of the morality to me is the kind of morality that's apolitical.
Yes,
treat people decently. That certainly should be an apolitical point of view, I think.
And I infamously, and when I say infamously, I mean just between you and me.
Yes.
I infamously have not watched anything of the modernized version.
Right, which is very blatant in its sort of political references. And
yes.
And honestly, I don't know. I mean, I liked it, but I don't know that it maybe will hold up because it's so grounded in that mid-2000s War on Terror kind of period.
Yeah. And deliberately so, whereas I think it's fair to say that regardless of maybe it was a little ahead of its time, like you say, in some kind of like neocon outlook, but it would be tough to credibly watch this show now and say, oh man, this is totally capturing the politics of 1978.
Right.
It's more of a timeless kind of thing. You're right. It's not. It's of its time in some ways, like various disco references throughout the series. But as far as other stuff, political ideology, no, not at all.
They did have a fuel crisis at some point, right?
That's right. Yes. But what they didn't have that they maybe should have had would be a charismatic, down-home Southern leader of somebody in the fleet that would challenge Adama's leadership, or and
right,
be a voice for the civilians.
Well, that the nuclear disarmament episode, I guess, was happening. Some of the SALT conferences were going on around the same time,
mm-hmm.
And so at least these people read it in part as a commentary on that. Although Reagan was in favor of a lot of that stuff too.
Yeah. And another interesting thing about that in those episodes you mentioned, the focus shifted to the Eastern Alliance.
Yes.
And of course, what is the imagery of a lot of the uniforms and even the accents of the Eastern Alliance? What does it remind you of? Nazis, of course.
Nazis until they get to the planet, and then it's Bolsheviks.
Yes.
Or maybe those are the West. I got my alliances confused, but
Yeah, maybe that was part of the alliance part was, but it's just kind of one of those things. And again, part of the one of the funny things about this show is seeing visions of the future and how much they resemble imagery of the past or the present and things like that.
yes, and every now and then they get something like Adama's little speech to text captain's log thing
Ah,
that he starts to use about midway through.
that's great, and I love that. That was another great development in the show. That the fact that most episodes, except strangely, the one that we're talking about today, the one that we will talk about eventually, we promise. But I really like that bit, him doing like sort of a captain's log at the beginning, and just laying things out because Lauren Green is so cool.
Yeah.
And I just liked it. I mean, and it would be a way to get like little bits of information in there in a cool way and give the visual of the text appearing on the now looking primitive screen. But I really like that feature. That was great. Whoever thought of let's do that.
And boy, in 1978, I'm sure everyone was. I wasn't because I was 5, but people would watch it. Oh wow, that would be great to have someday.
Yeah.
Oh, now we can just do that on our phone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And now something else I want to say before we get into the episode. A theory I sort of came up with while watching it, this show in particular, but this applies to our era here. There's this divide you hear about between TV acting and movie acting, and I don't think it's really as big a deal now, but I can see it. Like if you look at the acting on this show in 1978, around the same time as things like Taxi Driver, it's a different style of acting. To me, it is more in keeping with sort of 30s and 40s film acting, and where movie acting had kind of moved on to this method, more realistic kind of acting. The TV acting tended to be more straightforward still.
Mm-hmm.
It's not bad. I think some people would look at it and say, oh, they're bad actors, but
No,
I don't think
it's a different style.
Yeah, certainly Lauren Green and Richard Hatch and Dirk Benedict, and really almost everyone on here is doing a good job. It's just a little more earnest and a little more flat and straight ahead. And part of that I think is time constraints too. You're making a TV show every week. You don't have time to really dig into the character. Even though you are building a character over time, you don't have the time to fuss about it, I guess. You got to get the lines delivered and move on.
You know what? I think you're right. That's a great point. And I'm trying to think if there's many exceptions in the cast, and really I don't think there are. I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, I mean even the kid, Boxy, is a pretty good for a kid actor. And I think they keep the writing pretty good for him, other than him constantly sneaking onto ships that he shouldn't be on.
Yeah.
He does pretty well, and the adults act well with him. He loosens things up a little bit, I think.
And that would be something, and it seems like maybe early on or at some point there might be some kind of tension there. I bet there was a temptation, maybe a directive to feature him more. And again, they kind of get away from that at the end of it. And he's not even in the last episode, I think.
No, he kind of disappears a little bit.
He's conspicuous by his absence. And in one of the ones before that, he's seen in a classroom setting, which is something you hadn't really seen yet on the show. And he's put in more of a kid role than somebody who's going along on the adventures with him. It makes it a little bit more realistic.
Right. And of course, he has his robot Muffet dog, or his robot Daggett, named Muffet. And that really weirds me out. It's like a cool looking little suit and stuff, but it's a chimp walking around in that suit. And I just can't get past that. I feel really bad for that chimp.
Yeah. There's a bonus feature on the Blu-ray set that talks about that. And Lori was disappointed to find that out.
Yes. I mean, if it had been Henry Silva, I guess I would feel bad for him too. At least he had a choice.
Yeah. But the Daggett was something, again, that they kind of got away from that. And certain episodes, they featured it more than others.
Yeah, he got his big hero moment in the fire episode.
Yes. I think Fire in Space, I think, is the episode title, which tells you all you need to know. And I thought it was a really good episode.
Which I believe, I think there are 2 episodes, and you mentioned that one and the trial one, that both have Michael Sloan of The Master gets story credits, but they totally rewrote the scripts. And something weird, or the original Fire in Space had the murder plot in it too, or something. It's a little confusing, but he at least was sort of involved.
Yeah.
The main people are people like Glenn Larson and Donald Bellisario, and quite often behind the directors in the director's chair are buddy Rod Holcomb.
Yeah, the great Rod Holcomb.
Yes. Not this episode, but I bet at least half of them.
Yeah. And one thing, and we could kind of transition into the details of the specific episode, actually, if you don't mind, because there's one more kind of point I want to make, like the ratings for the show. Now, the show was canceled after one season, and then there was, I guess, a big write-in campaign that led to Galactica 80, which was a critical and commercial failure. But one thing I've read in several places that the ratings started off strong. I think that's indisputable. I think the movie did very well, and I've seen several references that say that by the end only the kids were watching. That it was more of a children's show, and that was one of the reasons why it was canceled. In addition, it seems like many places agree that the cost of the show was a factor. But I'm kind of wondering about the ratings because there was something else that happened too, and that was like CBS. And I read at least one place that said CBS did this in response to Battlestar Galactica. CBS moved All in the Family and Alice, I think it was, which were still top 10 shows at the time, to 8 o'clock to go directly up against Battlestar Galactica, and then the ratings went down. I mean, that's kind of another factor there. And maybe part of the reason that the audience was skewing younger was because some of the adults were siphoned off by that programming move by CBS. I don't know. I'd like to get some more detailed ratings information because I'm skeptical that the ratings for Battlestar had gone down that far that quickly. And plus, so many of the episodes in the second part of the season seem more adult oriented, anyways.
Well, I know as a kid I stopped watching when CBS made that change.
You were like, okay,
I needed to see my Archie and Alice.
Yes. And like at the beginning of the season, it was different. Well, should I just get into maybe what was on that night? Okay, so ABC had at 7 o'clock John Denver's Rocky Mountain Reunion. I think they had the Hardy Boys on it at this time, but this was a special one-night special with John Denver. Then this episode of Battlestar Galactica, which wound up being the series finale, and then a 1975 movie called Master Gunfighter, the Sunday night movie after that. Okay, so NBC had at 7 o'clock Wonderful World of Disney, and it was part 2 of Tattooed Police Horse, a 1960s live action movie. One of those deals where they'd show one half one week and then finish it the next week. Then they had their big event presentation was the 1976 movie Swashbuckler. I think Oliver Reed and maybe Robert Shaw, a couple others in there. And then an Edwin Newman NBC News presentation called College Sports Incorporated. Big money on campus. And go figure, in 1979, people were thinking that maybe there's a lot of money in college athletics, Fortunately, of course, that's not the case now. CBS had 60 Minutes, of course, at 7 o'clock. Okay, and then this night it was All in the Family, One Day at a Time, Alice, Stockard Channing, and Just Friends, which, yes, that was the name of the sitcom. Stockard Channing in Just Friends. Almost as clunky as Paul Sand's Friends and Lovers or whatever that was. Matter of fact, this might be worse. And then the Mary Tyler Moore Hour. And I'm bringing that up because, like, when the season began, the show was called just Mary. It was a failed variety show. This is the one with David Letterman, I think Michael Keaton. And that didn't do very well. So that was, I'm sure that was part of the reason too. Like, hey, we need to shore up our 8 o'clock hour. So when Battlestar Galactica premiered, it was not going up against like those venerable CBS comedies. It was going up against Mary Tyler Moore doing a variety show, which didn't work. So there's multiple things going on. But on this particular Sunday night, April 29th, Battlestar Galactica, it was at 8 o'clock against Archie and One Day at a Time.
I just wanted to add that in reference to the Edwin Newman on the remake of Battlestar Galactica, one of the phrases that brought up a lot was, all this has happened before and all this will happen again. Unfortunately, I didn't have it on the tip of my tongue, so.
I thought for a minute that you were going to talk about Edwin Newman making an appearance on the reimagined Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, that would have been something.
I was like, wow, I remember him hosting Saturday Night Live, but I didn't remember that he was in the mid-2000s Battlestar Galactica.
No, he unfortunately he wasn't. Marvin Cobb wasn't.
All right, we've got a lot to talk about here with
yes.
Battlestar. It's really a fascinating show, and yeah, one that I urge people to dive back into.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not on Peacock. It is, last we knew, it was on the NBC.com app with excessive commercials.
It is on Tubi right now. I haven't checked it out on there because I've been watching the Blu-rays.
Yes, right. I had to get the Blu-rays too because the commercials were driving me crazy.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I did. It was much easier to watch them that way. And they look good.
Yeah, they do. They've got deleted scenes and some bonuses. So yeah, I'd recommend picking up the Blu-rays for sure.
I've tried to watch some of the deleted scenes, but I just can't quite get into that. Sometimes they're just different versions of scenes you've seen too.
Right, or like a 5-second snippet of something, hardly essential viewing. Now, every now and then you'll see something that, like, that 10 seconds, that would have explained, that did set something up later.
Right.
But, when you got a skilled helmsman like Rod Holcomb,
yes,
you don't necessarily need all that information. He can get it across with his storytelling.
That's right.
So he was probably able to trim scenes like that out.
So this one is called The Hand of God, and it was written and directed by Donald Belisario, future creator of Magnum PI and Quantum Leap and the NCIS franchise. And I believe he's got, did we talk about before? He's got big ties to your alma mater.
I don't know if we mentioned that before or not, but yes, he's a big supporter of Pennsylvania State University and big contributor.
Building named after him? Or,
Yeah.
or a whole school?
It was after I left. I don't remember offhand.
Anyway, in this episode, it opens with Apollo. We've mentioned Richard Hatch, Starbuck, Dirk Benedict of A-Team fame, Sheba, Anne Lockhart, and I know you've got a whole thing about the pronunciation of, is it, they say Cassiopeia, right?
They do, but I don't think they always say it like that. I thought it started out as Cassiopeia.
Right.
And then they make a point to say Cassiopeia. And then by the end of this season, it seems like they're calling her Cass more often.
Yeah.
But in the bonus features, they're calling her Cassiopeia.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if that was a conscious change.
Maybe just is easier to say.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe that's just what they were saying, and they stopped correcting them.
Yeah.
Anyway, played by, what's that actress's name?
Laurette Spang.
Yes. So those two are kind of the female leads at this point. Didn't necessarily start out that way. In fact, Anne Lockhart's character was brought in midway, and she's a pilot like Apollo and Starbuck. Cass is a former worker of a kind, and now she's a nurse.
Careful. 2 to 11-year-old demographic.
That's right. A socializer. Isn't that what they called her or something?
Yeah,
like that?
I like that. Something like that. A socializer, yes. Draw your own conclusions.
Anyway, and she is Starbuck's girl, more or less. Sheba is not involved with anyone yet.
I read, and it's perfectly, well, I shouldn't say perfectly reasonable, but it's understandable that the network was uncomfortable with Cassiopeia's role. But what's a little bit ridiculous is in order to get her in, they made her like the second ranking medical officer on the Battlestar, like all of a sudden. Like at first it looks, they kind of start off just like having her help out, and then very soon afterwards she's like a medical expert, and that strains credibility. But
yeah, I mean, it in one sense it fits the idea that people just got to help out where they can. But yeah, she does quickly become very important in that medical bay.
And as a matter of fact, it seems like they essentially have 2 doctors, because there's another episode where they have to bring doctors from another ship. Like, and they're not even real doctors. They make it sound like I forget how they refer to them, not interns or something, but I digress. There's many fascinating aspects of the life in the fleet that they don't always get into in detail. But it
seemed like they not only did they give her an acceptable job, but they're like and put her like in a really unflattering sort of canvas dress.
Yeah.
Instead of having her, wear sexy clothes or even pants or something.
Yeah, and her character is kind of like an embodiment of the whole TV show rule, which so many times one of the big things about the series is that Starbuck and Apollo are like the experts at everything.
Yes.
Like they're not just the best fighter pilots, they're the best this, they're the best people for this, they're the best at sports, so I guess it's better than having a cast of like 50 people, but yeah, it's something to kind of it's a source of comedy throughout the series too.
Anyway, Apollo's leading them to this area, which turns out to be like an observation area where they can see 360 degrees. And it was used 500 yarn ago when the Galactica was first made to get star sightings to help double check the navigation computers. And he likes to come up there and just kind of hang out and be at peace. And he's got sort of this love of history in the past and things like that. And while they're up there, there's like a communications thing, and it receives a partially broken up signal from somewhere, and they record it, and then they take it and get Boomer, who's like the third of the gang of guys, to interpret it. And there's like a fun scene where they wake him up in the barracks, and he was having a dream about a girl, and then he's standing there in his space boxers, and
yeah,
the ladies laugh at him, and there's a nice deleted scene where the shot ends and everybody's cracking up. It seems like this is a more advanced civilization. Should they really be acting that way?
Probably
no. They should be more mature, right? Anyway, they go to a lab, and he cleans up the audio, which doesn't make any sense to him, but we can kind of see the transmission and stuff, and it's pretty clear it's the moon landing from 1969.
The alleged moon landing from 1969. And again, kind of going to the point we talked about just a minute ago, is it turns out that Boomer is an electronics whiz. And this is something that there was one other episode, The Space Fire, where
right.
I think I told you just before it happened, I was thinking, oh no, don't make him be somebody that's and turns out he can get around and navigate open doors because he like used to hotwire vehicles or something when he grew up. And I was like, oh, did you really have to make one of the African American members of the cast be that? But here, it turns out, hey, he's like an electronics whiz,
Yeah.
and they're making it sound like he's the only guy other than the science officer who himself is spread very thin on this show.
Yes, he's conveniently on another ship.
Yes, so it's cool though that Boomer gets to be the one, analyzing the signal and rigging things up.
It is. I like him, and I like that he's included a lot of times. But of course, if you only need two people, then Boomer's going to be out. It's going to be Apollo and Starbuck.
Yeah, but Boomer is one of my favorites too, and actually they do a very good job. And I don't know if we want to get into this now, but as far as diversity,
Uh huh.
there's not an incredible amount of diversity, but you have like two black characters in indisputable positions of authority in this program, treated as equals, for the most part and everything. And it's really not even commented on or anything like that.
Right. I mean, it's because that's like a Earth thing. I mean, why would that matter? Why would people be hung up on that necessarily?
You would think, but Star Trek memorably got into issues like that and made it a thing, and other contemporary science fiction did. And this show, and you're absolutely right. I'm not saying it has to or anything, but it's notable. It may be one of the more progressive shows of the time as far as that goes, because of the way it had these prominent characters, and really were not featured because of their ethnicity or anything like that. It wasn't a part of their character at all.
So Herbert Jefferson plays Boomer, and Terry Carter plays Colonel Ty, and he's one of my favorites too.
I really like Colonel Ty. He's got a way of seeming like intense, but intense, like not super intense, like in an aggressive way, but just like intense, like he's constantly worried about it, and that like he's on the verge of like having a breakdown of some kind, but it's still composed. I really like his character too.
And he's got a really dry sense of humor.
Yes.
And the Terry Carter is really good at. Interesting you mentioned the breakdown, because the Colonel Ty of the reimagined series is definitely on the verge of a breakdown. Like all the time.
Yeah. Huh.
And also we're very intense.
This Colonel Ty has a nice rapport with Adama.
Yes.
And in most of his scenes throughout the series, I would say he's kind of on the bridge there with next to Lauren Green, and he holds his own and kind of straddles the world between like the officers and kind of that higher echelon of the upper leadership, and does a good job at that. And he was a regular on one of my favorite shows, Sergeant Bilko. 20 years earlier, he was one of the prominent African American actors on primetime television. Although they didn't do a whole lot with that character, but just the fact that he was there was seen as kind of a big deal at the time. So
I mean, this show did a good job of bringing older actors in, notable Fred Astaire and Ray Bolger, Lloyd Bridges.
Yeah,
Bobby Van.
Yeah, Bobby Van. Brett Summers. Well, maybe not.
Yeah,
maybe not in the same category, but
Ray Milland.
Yes.
So if they had in season 2 had somehow stumbled on Colonel Ty's old boss, Phil Silvers.
Oh, at the time, it was Phil Silvers was kind of a little bit of a shell of himself.
Yes.
At the time of the production of this, but he was still active. But oh man, to have a Phil Silvers in his prime have that kind of character, because we have a con man character or two in the series,
yes.
But to have somebody with the patter of Phil Silvers interacting with some of these other people would have been brilliant.
Running scams on some ship.
Oh, that would have been great.
Yeah. Well, yeah. He was on Fantasy Island around that time, right?
Yeah, Phil Silvers. Yeah, and he was on Happy Days like after this. And pardon me the digression there, but I don't think Ty had a huge role in this particular episode. So I'm glad we could talk about him for a minute or two, give him some props.
Strategized and arched an eyebrow or two. And they talk about this signal, and it's a gamma signal, and it could be from some sort of harmonic, which means it could be nearby, or it could be intergalactic, which means it could be something from 100 or 1,000 or even 10,000 yarn ago. And we know it's from a Stanley Kubrick film in some secret studio, right?
Of course, yes.
Yes. Anyway, then Adama wants to follow the idea that it's close by, and gets Ty to start a scan and sends some fighters on patrol and keeps Boomer working on the signal. And so Apollo and Starbuck and Sheba go to this galaxy. And at this point, we get our first hint, even though, we had the tease of the moon landing, that it's probably not our galaxy. There are only 5 planets, at least where they are, and don't seem to be any life forms. But they split up to look at the first 3 planets. Now, they seem to be covering a lot of ground very quickly, but
they sure do, yeah. Or those planets are right on top of each other.
Yes, and even hyperspace. It's just like, oh, it's like you go check out that street and I'll check out this street.
Yeah, exactly.
So a couple of them are gas giants, and then Starbuck is coming up on one that's kind of looks like our moon, like just a big rock with no atmosphere. And then he says no. He gets a signal on his scanner, and a Cylon base star, which is their version of the Battlestar, and looks kind of like two flying saucers on kind of connected, I guess, or a spool. Anyway, he sees that, and that's no good. And they haven't seen Cylons for quite a while now. So they go back and they tell obviously Adama about that, and he has Ty and one of the main officers, Omega, scanning.
Isn't that Omega?
Oh yeah, it is Omega. I'm sorry. Anyway, the good thing is that they're not, since they can't get a signal, that means they're not in scanning range of this thing either. And they realize that the communication could be a trap, but Adama and Ty are both tired of their normal thing, which is to run. And for the first time, they have an advantage, and they both decide that they should attack.
Some interesting psychology here. Adama has been relatively conservative, but throughout the rest of the series, but a lot of times because there's been people that have been more rash than him. But it's interesting, and they had kind of laid the groundwork a little bit. I think they had talked, like, I don't think it was this episode, but like in some ones previously, they had mentioned how they're increasingly finding habitable planets. So it's easy to draw the conclusion that, okay, maybe some people in the fleet are sharing this and getting restless. I didn't get the sense that Adama was, being reckless, although he was kind of risking, this Battlestar. But it's believable. He's just like, I'm tired of running, and you can kind of see like the warrior in him coming out, and like this is a chance to put this aside. And you can also believe that it might have been kind of a blow at first, seeing Cylons after, like you said, not seeing them for so long, and we the viewers had not seen them for a while, and they were treating them like they had talked about increasing recreation, things like that, and indulging in ceremony or whatever he'd put it in the one episode. But it would have been kind of a blow, like, oh, we thought we'd gotten rid of them, or we at least put them, in our rearview mirror, and now here they are again. So we can't go start over. We have to do something now. So I really like this. I thought it was interesting on many levels.
Yeah, it's still practical in the sense that he knows they have this advantage.
And there's even there's debate about it inside, and people are pointing out, hey, we did this, and he's like, but this time, there's just one base ship, and he's countering their arguments, but they have a little bit of discussion about it.
Yeah, they do. And even, I mean, Ty's first instinct as well, they have to fly the long way around, essentially. And the problem they have always is that they have this fleet of hundreds of mostly civilian ships to deal with.
A ragtag fleet, if you will.
Yes. And the old adage of moving a battleship, turning a ship, but they have to turn hundreds of them, which presumably stretch back a number of, as they say in Galactica, 80 space miles.
Space miles?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I'm getting an increasingly negative premonition about Galactica 80, even though I'm going to watch it.
I don't think they. I mean, they have all these other words for time.
Yeah,
like yarns and centons and microns and whatever. But distance, I think, is usually just like metric system, right?
I think they had something like parsecs, don't they?
Well, parsecs, I mean, that's a physics term. Yeah, they might use that. So, but they definitely don't say space miles.
Kilometers. I think in at least one episode they use kilometers too. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's a brief scene of some Cylons just, having a chat about things, which I got a kick out of, just how long it went on.
Yeah.
Because usually on the earlier in the season, when this Baltar, the trader, he was running a base star, and usually the conversations would involve him and this other kind of Cylon who was voiced by the guy who played Dr. Smith on Lost in Space.
Jonathan Harris.
Jonathan Harris, yeah. So, it was two sort of Britishy sounding people talking, not a super robot-roddy person. But this is like 2 minutes of these guys just They send some fighters out to patrol. And then there's a cool kind of fun, they cut from a shot of the base star in space to a briefing room where they're using that actual model, like in show as a model.
Yeah, that was pretty cool, wasn't it?
Yeah. And Ty's pointing out, all the weapons on it, and explaining what the plan, which is that they will send all of their Vipers in to draw out the Cylon fighters, and they'll be outnumbered 2-1, but they're used to that. And the Galactica will come in past the sun from the opposite direction, and then there's a nice thing where Ty says the officers' club will be open to everyone for an hour, and everyone gets one drink on Adama.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Some ambrosia.
Yeah.
But of course, Apollo, being the serious guy that he is, He's thinking that they could guarantee this if there was some way they could get into the base star and knock out the scanners. And Starbuck's like, yeah, well, we just fly in there and we climb in and we destroy the computers and fly out and it'll be fine. And Apollo's like, you're right.
Yeah.
But they have a card up their sleeve because they have Baltar's Cylon fighter. And so they can fly that in and pretend to be Cylons. And then they cut, and, some good storytelling again, just efficient storytelling that immediately to Adama saying no. He's got a lot of questions, about how this would work, how would they find their way around in this ship they've never been in and all of this. And then he realizes it could work if they get intel from Baltar.
And they make a reference to Starbuck had been taken captive by them before, which is cool. And that's one thing that the show became increasingly serialized too at some point, and not in the sense of like oppressively so, but as far as making references to previous episodes and having them connect more. Whereas before everything seemed a little bit more disjointed, and that's something I appreciated. And I like the nod to that other episode early on where Starbuck had sort of seen the inner workings of a base ship, I guess.
Yeah. So Baltar was taken prisoner in an episode, and I know you email me and like, oh, I fully expect him not to be in jail anymore the next episode and be back with the Cylons. And, they stuck with that. They left him in prison, and they even had an episode where he tried to break out. They built up like this crew of villains, had them try to break out. I enjoyed that.
It was a nice thing in the sense that they built up Baltar, but didn't feel the need to feature him in every single episode.
Yeah.
Which again kind of it gave the show a little bit more credibility that they didn't shoehorn him into every single plot.
Right. Played by, we should mention, the great John Colicos.
Yes, and talk about some fine TV acting. Am I right? He is one that is having a great time in this series.
Yes.
And I was glad to see one of the bonus features. I think they referenced that boy, he was, I think even, was it Rod Holcomb or somebody made a reference to maybe every now and then having to dial him back a little bit. But he's a lot of fun to watch. Even like his first his credit shot at the beginning, he's got this like hilarious look on his face.
Yeah. And we have a scene between where he and Adama negotiate for this information. So Adama says he'll set him free and put him on a habitable planet with provisions and shelter. And Baltar wants some ability to communicate. So Adama agrees to give him short range communications once the base star is destroyed. And they have like a space handshake where they, shake each other's forearms.
Space handshake, yes.
Yes.
But, a very big moment in the series, because although Adama's had to work with Baltar on several occasions, this is something different.
Right, and you assume, if you've been watching, that Baltar is going to trick him.
Yeah, you can't totally rule that out for sure.
No. And then we see Apollo and Starbuck on the Cylon ship, the Cylon fighter, which they did, in the space fights, they'll show the Cylons kind of inside these fighters sometimes. And the Cylon fighters, quite frankly, are super cool. I mean, they're just flying saucers, really, but they're really cool looking.
They really are. Yeah.
And like when we had the toys, my brother had that toy, and I had the Viper, and I was kind of envious of his, really.
Understandable.
But I love seeing how much time we see the inside of that ship, which is very, very spacious compared to a Viper.
Right.
And the Vipers are very cool, too. And so Boomer gives them this transmitter and says, so we'll be able to recognize you. Like, it'll send a signal to all the Vipers, and they'll see a little red dot on their scanner and know not to shoot them down.
Otherwise, we'll have no way of knowing, that it's you. So whatever you do, make sure you don't lose that transmitter. I think he actually turned to the camera and said that at one point.
Yes.
Whatever these guys do, folks, they absolutely do not want to lose this transmitter that I rigged up for them in the last 5 minutes.
That's right.
It's critical to the whole mission. I think I've made my point.
I think so. And then both of the Cassiopeia and Sheba come into the ship too, and Cassiopeia wants to talk to Starbuck. They go off, and Sheba has a serious talk with Apollo. It seems like, first she kind of wants on the mission, and he's like, well, no, I need you and Boomer to lead the other Vipers, and she's angry with him and thinks he has a death wish. Because in an early episode, he got married to a character played by Jane Seymour, and she died. And Sheba wasn't around for that, but she does, Serena was a wonderful woman. Maybe they knew each other before. It's sort of weird, but this is a very effective scene, I think. And Sheba's like kind of mad at him and sad and worried. And she points out that he's not the only one who's lonely. So she lost her father, and and most of she was on a different ship. It's a whole thing, but most of those people seem to have died, and she's going through stuff. And she suggests that maybe they in the past they've been tough on each other because they were hiding other feelings, and she kisses him, and which they've been kind of hinting at some of that, but it's a little unclear how much time has passed. So he did lose his wife, though, so I can understand why he would be slow to start anything.
Now, to me, this was a very good scene. I agree with you. However, I thought that the contentiousness between them had not been built up as much as the attraction between them. And I kind of already assumed that they were an item, and maybe it's just kind of like taking it from, oh, like having a drink in the officers club to, doing something more serious. So to me, it wasn't a big surprise, but the scene was very effective, though, because it established this relationship and also, again, kind of building up the stakes. I mean, even Adama letting everybody into the officers club and giving them a free drink and all this stuff, they did a really good job of building up that this isn't just a normal mission or even a normal dangerous mission or even a normal suicidal mission, which Starbuck and Apollo always seem to go on.
Right.
Like that this is a really big deal. So I agree this is a very effective scene.
Yeah, and it's followed up immediately by Cassiopeia and Starbuck having a very similar scene that I think also works, and it's the same idea. Like, why is it always you that goes on these missions? And he's kind of like, well, he doesn't want to have to dwell on what could go wrong. That's no way to live. Which sometimes he has a laissez-faire attitude, but I think that might be a good attitude to have.
He is a very live in the moment kind of guy. He's juggled girlfriends before in the show.
Yes.
But yeah, it does seem to be, especially for a hotshot Viper pilot who's on all these dangerous missions and somebody who's very committed to his friend. I mean, you could argue that the ultimate relationship in the show is Apollo and Starbuck, and just the fact that their friendship is very cool in the way that they always will work to help each other and will never leave each other behind. And I think that's very admirable and one of the cooler aspects of the series. But yeah, Starbuck is a very live in the moment kind of guy.
They'll always play triad together.
That's right.
Yes, I agree with everything you said there. And then they get their explosives to take in the thing, and Boomer reminds them and us again, about that scanner. And the Starbuck's like, well, if it doesn't work, we'll waggle our wings.
Yeah.
And then we get a sense to like Boomer wishes he was on the mission, just like Sheba did.
He does. I mean, they're all strong personalities. That's kind of cool that they always want to be on there. I mean, I think maybe the only one, maybe Jolly, who we haven't mentioned yet, I think maybe sometimes would be content just having a drink in the officers club.
Right.
But yeah, it's cool. I mean, again, it's admirable that they all want to be out there, but at the same time, they'll listen to reason. Apollo will never listen to any argument that involves him not doing something, and Starbuck is probably right there with him, but Boomer recognizes, you guys are right. We don't need all three of us going on this one. But I like the fact that he wants to be there.
But so you mentioned Jolly, who's the sort of overweight pilot.
He's a little husky.
I think that's a deleted scene where you see him shirtless. The pilot movie made. He's got a hairy back. Some of the other pilots that have shown up, well, there are a bunch of women who got trained as pilots, and we sort of see one in some, I think, reused footage in this going on the mission. And Larry Manetti played one for a while.
That's right.
And my favorite, Ed Begley Jr. as Green Bean.
Yes.
Not even String Bean, but Green Bean.
No, Green Bean. And one interesting one is Rick Springfield.
Oh yeah.
At the very beginning was actually a brother of Apollo's, and
he died.
Yeah, he was not seen or mentioned in the rest of the series, as far as
I think he was mentioned a couple of times, but
he was okay.
Early on,
yeah.
Yeah, I think Athena, who we don't see because the actress left the show, his sister, Apollo's sister, I think she brought him up a few times, especially when dealing with Starbuck and kind of. Their romance. It didn't come a romance. But Baltar gives them a little more information. You're going to have to go into the central core of the ship and blow up some computers. And then there's a nice thing where Apollo, they're in the ship and Apollo says, you know how to fly this thing? Starbuck's like, I thought you did. And they both have a good laugh.
Yeah, that is pretty funny. I did like that.
And then pretty much we have a big battle.
Yeah, and I think a lot of new footage, right? I mean, it seems like they saved up a lot for this last episode, it looked like to me.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but yeah, I think there's a decent amount.
They reuse a lot of, the launch shots, and there's certain things they recycle time and again, but I think this episode had a lot of new space combat footage. And even if it wasn't all new, it was pretty cool. It was well done.
Yeah. And the guys managed to get in a patrol of Cylon ships, and they land, and they're climbing down a ladder, and the guard looks up at them, and it's a big slow motion thing, and Apollo's Starbuck.
Yeah, yes.
But they shoot him, and they set their charges, and the Vipers are doing their job, and Galactica comes in, and everything, the plan works, and we don't know what's going on with Starbuck and Apollo, if they've gotten away or not. And then there's a Cylon ship flying into Galactica. There's no red dot, but it waggles its wings. Because I forgot to mention that most important thing: when they're fleeing, when they're getting out of the computer core area, Starbuck drops the transmitter and it blows up or breaks.
Yeah.
So,
Oops.
that one thing he wasn't supposed to do.
Yeah, and Laurie pointed out that I guess you could say maybe they were going to, in retrospect, maybe he should have just not even taken it with him on this thing. Like he didn't need to have it in his pocket or whatever. But I guess that would leave the flexibility they could have taken any ship to get out of there, I guess.
Right, yeah.
As long as he had that transmitter. I mean, what are the odds of him dropping it like that? That was 1,000,000 to 1 that he was carrying it around like that he would drop it. Another thing I like too is Adama is monitoring this, and very hands-on military commander sometimes. But he's kind of looking at the monitors, and he just keeps there's no red dot on that one, and he all but says, well, no red dot, so I guess we can blow it up because we know for 100% sure that it's not Starbuck and Apollo in that one. But just to kind of wait, no red dot. Oh, no red dot.
And then when Boomer says no, and he's like they're waggling, and they pan over to Ty, and he's waggling.
Yeah, there's a lot of in this series. There's no time to explain now, but trust me,
Yes.
You can't fire at them, or there's no time to explain, but trust me, we have to do this radical move.
Right. And the last scene, Apollo is up in the dome again, and Starbuck finds him there and says there's a celebration going on, and they might get some medals. And Apollo's just he still thinks the recording was not part of a trap, and he says Boomer rigged some sort of booster, but there's nothing coming in. But he thinks it came from Earth, and part of that came earlier. He mentioned that the ship looked a lot like colonial ships had in their history books or whatever. And as they're climbing down, Starbuck bumps a button that turns on the monitor, and they don't see it, but the message comes in loud and clear. And again, for us, the audience, we recognize that it's the moon landing, and of course this is only 9 years after that. Very fresh in people's minds at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it ends, with the hint that they're getting closer to Earth, and a lot of questions still. I mean, it could be, as I said, a recent transmission, or it could be that it's from hundreds or thousands of years in Earth's past. Excuse me, yarns.
Yes.
And like that, to me, is an idea that I like better than what they came up with in Galactica 80, which is them traveling another 30 years and ending up 11 years in the future of that transmission. But, if they had eventually kept going with the show and found Earth, and it had been Earth's future or Earth's distant past, maybe that would have been more interesting. Just 1980.
Yeah. One thing that stands out too is, I think, again, another course correction, or maybe just the way it played out in the show. Like, there was a stretch maybe in the middle of the season where Adama became increasingly obsessed with the idea of finding Earth, to the point where I think maybe he was getting a little reckless with some of his decisions, and they scaled that back a lot. Maybe they just weren't as conscious about it, but it was still there enough to make you realize why Adama's, why he makes other decisions, and why they're not just stopping at one of these other planets, and just getting out of it that way. And also Apollo becomes increasingly interested in that idea too as the series goes on. And I think they had it pretty well calibrated by the end here, where that it's why it's important to them. But didn't it seem like for a while, like there were 1 or 2 episodes, especially, where Adama just seemed like totally like he couldn't think of anything else. Like this was his one thing, almost to the expense of everything else.
Right, and it starts out as almost like a religious, or not almost like it, as a religious. I mean, the idea comes from religious texts, historio-religious texts. Is that a word? But they're guiding them. Their sort of version of the Bible or whatever is guiding them, and it happens to be that certain things get proven true, and so that helps. But he does, and the only kind of salvation is that he's always right that the planet they're looking at is a bad choice.
Right.
Like it is ruled by bug people who are eating humans or something.
Yes. Yeah, there was that one episode where he goes down like sort of like the Egyptian thing.
Yeah.
Where he wants to see these drawings, and he's just like, there's like a fervor to him that they kind of downplayed that eventually. It was interesting, but
and it keeps playing out. He has this medallion, and it fits perfectly in this thing to unlock a secret door, and they do kind of like you say, downplay it. And the interesting thing on the remake, was that idea was there, but Adama was actually an atheist. He started out as an atheist, but he saw it as a good sort of a goal when they were in desperate need.
Like something that could unite
Yeah,
the people.
exactly. But then as they went on and went to their version of that planet, he started to believe, maybe not in the religious parts, but believed that it was a legitimate goal.
Yeah, I like that they scaled back that with Adama in the original series, and also at the same time they boosted up just a little bit in Apollo. I think it makes him more interesting character. He becomes like a little bit more philosophical and not just a warrior, but someone with vision beyond just fighting Cylons, which I thought was a good way to make his character more interesting too by the end of the series.
Yeah, and I think those main characters, those two, and Starbuck even is more complicated than he seems. Like he's not just a rogue, but they get into his childhood a little bit and how he was a sort of a war orphan and doesn't have a lot of attachments because of that, and that's pretty interesting. And then him trying to easing into the idea of being in a monogamous relationship with Cassiopeia.
Right.
And he's really less inclined to. There are times where he thinks about like leaving the military.
Mm-hmm.
That he's not as warrior-y as he might have seemed. Like it's sort of a job.
Yeah, like he embraces it while he's in it, and it's what he does. It does seem a little bit like the idea of him just like retiring and becoming a farmer seems a little far fetched. Him being happy at that. Whereas Apollo, on like at least one or two episodes I'm thinking of, seems open to the idea, or at least tempted by the idea of like settling down on another planet with somebody else and just having a kind of an agrarian life.
Yeah, I think he could. He would bring the same passion to it.
Yes.
Anything he did, I think.
Another thing that was interesting about this episode is a lot of things happened in it, and it was well paced, but it's almost surprising that it wasn't a 2-part episode, considering the sheer amount of 2-part episodes throughout the series. That it seems like a lot happened. Just the stuff with Baltar could have been drawn out a little bit more, and I was kind of impressed that they packed as much as they did into one episode.
Yeah, I would have liked a final shot of Baltar sitting on some empty planet by himself.
Yeah.
Well, here I am.
Yeah.
And speaking of him, but not that I'm 100% sure on him, but between Lauren Green and Ricardo Montalban and possibly John Colicos, are we looking at a best toupee category for this year's baddies?
Uh-oh. Whoa. I totally wasn't expecting this, but as soon as you started that, I had a feeling you were going to end up there. And you've given me something to think about.
Yeah. Again, I'm not 100% sure on him, but we know. I looked up Ricardo, and that's like public knowledge.
Okay.
And Lauren Green, we've been told, had one. So by a reliable source. So I
yeah, well,
if only we'd had Shatner.
It would break precedent, but yeah, I think there's enough to sustain the category there. Folks, let us know if you'd like to see that category this year. Can I just mention a couple things that I love about Battlestar Galactica that we haven't mentioned yet?
Sure.
And, jump in if you have any comments on that. I love the music. I love the theme song, but was it Stu Phillips and the Los Angeles Philharmonic or whatever it is? I don't care if it sounds like other stuff at the time. It's great. It's majestic. It's epic. And it makes the show seem like a big deal each time. I absolutely love you get Adama's voiceover setting it up. And kind of along with that, one of the simple pleasures I love, and granted, watching this in a Blu-ray without commercial breaks, I'm not exactly sure how it went, but you have the theme song and stuff, and then you come back with the episode title and the also starring that has, like the Herb Jefferson and some of the other characters, and with like little shots of them. And to me, it just adds to the drama somehow. I just can't describe it, but I just love that aspect of the show and the show's beginning. Each episode, it's great.
I love the music, and so another disappointment in Galactica 80 that I've seen so far. Stu Phillips is still doing the music, but clearly the music budget was knocked down a lot, and he's resorting to the wacky pizzicato strings of the 1980s, which is the wacky wah-wah guitar.
Oh boy.
For comedy scenes, and other than the theme song, doesn't really have the orchestra to work with. So, but I love that theme song, and I mean, yes, it's Star Wars like, but the Star Wars music was harkening back to classical music in a certain period, and it's not entirely original either. So I don't have a problem with that, and it's unique to TV of this time to have a big orchestra and everything. So yeah, I like I have mixed feelings about the other thing you mentioned, just because I feel like those actors deserve to be in the main credits.
I thought the same way at first, but as I got into the series more, I began to really like that as like a separate, distinct part of the opening, and thought, well, in a way, this kind of builds the tension, and it's kind of like a little second introduction kind of.
I do like the way they present it, though. If you're going to do that, you get their faces too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they do still seem prominent. And sometimes there are a few people we mentioned that, get to be in that even when they're not in episodes. So
Right.
I agree, and I love the spaceships, as I said. Here's an interesting bit of trivia, so we wind this down. We didn't see it here, but, the agrarian ships they have those models are from the movie Silent Running.
Oh, really?
And they're reused, or I think they reused the models and not the shots, but which John Dykstra, I think, helped on. But that movie was cited as against the various Lucas lawsuits, because like Universal used that to say, well, your robots are derivative of our robots, and so then I watched the movie Silent Running, partly just to confirm that, but I'd never seen that movie before, and it's a bit of a weird movie if you haven't seen it.
That was one, I believe, has come up this season.
Yes,
A network showing of it in one of the other episodes. We just mentioned it in passing. So
that's right. Yeah.
Again, it's all connected.
It's all connected, yeah. So you've seen Bruce Dern in space with a hawk on his arm while Joan Baez sings. You really haven't seen science fiction. But I like seeing those shots of the fleet, and frankly, that's something they were able to accomplish before Star Wars, having a big fleet like that. So
real quickly, I'll mention another thing I love is phrases that sound like our phrases but are changed in slight ways. Like there's one episode where I think it was Apollo that says he feels like a real Equinus's atrium or something like that. And he's basically saying he feels like a horse's, rear or something like that. And again, there's a lot of that in the series, in addition to their mock swear words that I just love all that too.
Yes, frack and Felgerkarb.
Yes.
There might be another one.
There's like a snit bag or something like that. And there's some pretty good insults. And one thing too, you've read that book, you've seen all the episodes like I have. I seem to recall maybe one time we actually saw this, but here's something that's been bothering me throughout the whole series. What does the I am button do in the Viper? There's the launch button, the attack button, whatever they call it, and then there's the I am button on the right, and nobody ever fires that one.
No, I don't know what that. Maybe it's missiles or something. Because I don't know if you notice this, but especially in the pilot, like I believe like those controllers were repurposed from maybe some cameras or something, and there's certain shots in the pilot where they haven't re-lettered it, so the buttons will say like focus or something like that, like definitely camera things. And so with that though, I think we should wrap up this episode and wrap up this season.
Yeah, it's been a great season. Thanks for everybody for coming along, and stick around, because I think in a few centons we'll be back with a baddies show that we've already made reference to. So
centons or centons a minute, right?
Well, it'll seem like a few centons.
Okay.
I'm being, in the figurative sense.
Definitely not a few microns.
Not a yarn.
Yes, not a yarn either. Yeah. I don't remember if they had a term for a month. So
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. So some fraction of a yarn.
Yeah.
But we'll be back with the baddies. In the meantime, where can people get in touch with us? And even vote on possibly baddie categories.
Yes, I think that'll be coming very soon, but of course you can email us at mailbag@battleofthenetworkshows.com if you have any ideas or comments about Battlestar Galactica, and visit us at our Facebook group. Just go to Battle of the Network Show's Facebook page. There'll be instructions to join the group. We talk about TV of the 70s and 80s all the time, and yeah, we can discuss this stuff. We could obviously talk a lot more about Battlestar Galactica, and we'd love to have a conversation about it in the group, so just join if you're not already in there, and meet us in there.
Yeah, and let us know if you want us to one day suffer through Galactica 80.
Yes. Oh, I'm going to suffer through it. The question will be whether we talk about it in the show or not, I think.
Yeah.
At least I say that now. I haven't watched an episode yet, and I do not remember watching that as a kid. So
I remember someone telling me, like not being aware of it, and someone telling me about it and mentioning because they ride like some motorcycles and stuff, and then seeing it being very disappointed.
Yeah, in all innocence, you're thinking, hey, more Galactica. How bad can it be?
Yeah. No, even at a mere, I guess, 7 by then, I could tell it was inferior. Well, yeah, and if you want to support the show, in the meantime, we have our TeePublic store, has some cool logo designs, and our Rewind Stubs design, and something new will be up there sometime a little before the baddies. So,
sounds good. For now, I'm kind of drained. I think I'm about ready for a sleep period.
I'm ready for some ambrosia, I think.
Yeah, that sounds good too. This episode brought to you by Crazy Nick's Electronic Felger Car. Our prices are out of this galaxy. This episode also brought to you by Starbucks. Gambling habit. Can you spare a few credits for the poor guy? This episode brought to you by Your Command. Join us next time for another exciting episode of Battle of the Network Shows. Learn more, leave feedback, and suggest future episodes at battleofthenetworkshows.com. Follow us on Twitter at BatNetShows, and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Battle of the Network Shows.